the secret that the metal kept. The afternoon over the Midwest was deceptively calm, cornfields pressed flat by the wind and a sky the color of polished steel. United Flight 232, a DC-10 bound for Sioux City on a planned stopover, climbed into that gentleness with the confidence of routine. In the cockpit, Captain Al Haynes moved with the quiet precision of thousands of hours. First Officer William Records read the checklist. Flight Engineer Dudley Dvorak kept the numbers honest. Somewhere in the cabin, Lead Flight Attendant Jan Brown looked down the aisle at restless children and the fidgeting hands of parents who were already thinking of arrivals, not endings. Then, the metal spoke. It was not a warning so much as a rupture. An impact that did not sound like any system alarm, a sound that replaced certainty with uncomprehending silence. The number 2 engine's fan disc had shattered at altitude, a halo of titanium turning to shrapnel at impossible speed. In the split second between something and everything, all 3 hydraulic systems, A, B, and standby, were ripped open by shards that should have been trapped by design. The DC-10 was built for redundancy, but the lines ran too close together in the tail, and the unseen flaw made a mockery of the diagram. The aircraft no longer responded to its own muscles. The yoke moved. The airplane did not. Haynes tried again. Nothing. The jet began a slow, malignant roll to the right, the nose dipping as if some unseen hand had pressed it toward the earth. In the cabin, the passengers felt a change that language doesn't quite name. Gravity skewed, the floor no longer the floor. Jan Brown braced herself and became what great cabin crew become in the worst moment, the single calm voice that lives in people's heads long after. She moved among the rows, steady and specific, gathering attention the way you gather light in darkness, by refusing to let it go out. Help arrived in a 4th chair. Dennis Fitch, a training check airman deadheading in the cabin, was asked forward. He took one look at an airplane with no hydraulics and suggested something that should not have worked but would, using differential thrust from the 2 surviving wing engines to steer and pitch the jet, nursing power up on one side, easing it back on the other to counter the roll and arrest the descent. It was like trying to thread a needle wearing boxing gloves. The world narrowed to seconds and inches. Sioux City was alerted. Fire and rescue teams rolled to the runway with the quiet choreography of people who have rehearsed for nightmares. In the cockpit, 4 pilots fused into one mind. They accepted the airplane's ungovernable tendency to yaw and gave it a corridor to wobble inside. The plan, if you could call it one, was to ride the oscillation all the way down and hope the Earth would be merciful. Back in the cabin, Jan Brown delivered the kind of instructions you give when the future is a very small target. Brace positions, seats for children, what to hold, what to let go of. She took in each face as if memorizing them would matter, as if names could weigh down the moment and keep it from blowing away. The passengers held hands with strangers and whispered prayers in casual languages. Over Iowa, the sky remained indifferent. The approach was both miraculous and inadequate. Without hydraulics, the spoilers and elevators and rudder were rumors. The landing gear came down with gravity and luck. The jet, yawing and rolling, touched the runway at an angle it was never designed to survive. A wing struck first. Fire blossomed and the aircraft cartwheeled, broke and spilled its insides onto the field beside the runway. For a heartbeat, there was only noise. Then there were voices. Survivors crawled from ruptured fuselage sections, blinking through smoke, mud, and a rain of debris. Flight attendants, burned and battered, turned back into the wreckage to pull people out, calling over and over in a loop of training and love. "This way! Move! Don't stop!" Firefighters poured into the chaos they had practiced for in drills where no one screamed. And yet, amid the heat and diesel and the smell of scorched things that should never be scorched, there were patches of impossible kindness, a hand placed on a shoulder, A child lifted cleanly through a jagged opening, a stranger's jacket wrapped around someone else's shaking body. The field became a page on which human choices were written in quick lines. Some would never stop hearing the sounds from that day. Others would remember the way the wind carried smoke away, just enough to let them see the way out. The numbers mattered and didn't, the count of those lost, the tally of those saved. What mattered, the survivors say, was the way terror sharpened into instructions, and how, in that narrowing, people found each other. And then there was the wreckage, cooling now, a still life of violence, frozen in the heat. Investigators in white suits and careful hands began the quiet, devotional work of learning what the metal knew. They mapped the fractures, photographed the arcs, measured the places where force had become memory. They found titanium that had lived with a microscopic birth defect, a hard, bright inclusion from manufacturing that slept unnoticed inside the fan disk for years, accumulating tiny injuries from each revolution until the day it let go. They traced the bright path of shrapnel through hydraulic lines that had been routed together in a place no design should have allowed. A triple redundant system in that one location was a single point of failure disguised as safety. That was the secret buried in the wreckage, not just a part that broke, but a story about how confidence can make us careless. The DC-10's designers had imagined the worst, and then fate argued finer. Reliability had become ritual, inspection had become habit, and habits miss what they are not taught to see. In the aftermath, changes came, revisions to routing, to inspection protocols, to the way we think about redundancy itself. Families learned the names of metals they had never spoken, and those names became anchors for grief. Survivors returned to cornfields and kitchens, and the long, uneven work of living with a day that rearranged their lives. Captain Al Haynes, humble and steady, would later talk about teamwork as if it were an element on the periodic table, something you could reach for in a crisis and hold in your hands. Jan Brown would speak about children and belts and the decisions that systems force on you when there is no good option and time has become absence. If you listen closely to the stories told by those who walked away and by those who never truly did, you hear the same refrain. The airplane failed, and people didn't. The wreckage gave up its secrets reluctantly, but it did speak. And in those fragments, we found a mirror, not just of a broken machine, but of our own imperfect brilliance, the way we forget that even our best ideas cast shadows, and that safety is a moving target we must keep chasing with humility. As night finally gathered over the field, the lights receded, and the hush came back. Somewhere, a piece of titanium cooled, its shattered edges reflecting the last light. It had been a long time since it was mined, longer still since it was forged, and all of that history was now written on the grass. The secret of the metal was out. The question left behind was ours. What would we do with it? Memorial Day weekend, Chicago. The kind of late spring afternoon that fools you into believing that airports are just gateways and not crucibles. Sun on polished fuselages, heat shimmering over taxiways, promises of arrivals already rehearsed in 100 minds. American Airlines Flight 191 idled near the runway, a DC-10 with its left engine sighing at low power, its passengers buttoned into their own small stories, a business trip that would end at a dinner table, a graduation gift, a family row in seats 23A and B that would be laughed about later. Routine has a way of looking immortal right up until it isn't. In the cockpit, Captain Walter Lux carried the unshowy confidence of long experience. First Officer James Dillard read call-outs that felt as solid as the rivets in the skin around them. Flight engineer Alfred Udovich tended to the steady hum of systems that existed to prevent surprises. Takeoff thrust came up, the DC-10 leaned into its own roar, and the runway began to fall away in thick black stripes. Then, in the climb, something tore itself free from the script. Witnesses on the ground would later say they saw the left engine, number 1, separate from the wing, flip up and over, and then tumble away like a quarter tossed into brutal wind. Inside, the crew felt a jolt that did not belong to any checklist. The airplane yawed. Instruments blinked in ways a human face might when blood suddenly leaves it. In an instant, the engine's violent departure did more than rob the left wing of thrust. It chewed through hydraulic lines and ripped out the wiring that would have told the crew that other, quieter things were also going wrong. The DC-10 was designed to take an engine failure on the chin and keep flying. Pilots trained to fly on 2, even 1, to nurse wounded airplanes back into the pattern with nothing but skill and procedure. But this was not a clean failure. When the engine and pylon tore away, they pulled a piece of the airplane's thinking with them. Along the left wing's leading edge, slats, those panels that fatten the wing for low-speed lift, lost the pressure that kept them deployed. Aerodynamics, indifferent to optimism, shoved them back. Stall speed on the left side climbed like a bad fever. The airplane, following engine-out doctrine, flew at a target speed that should have been safe and wasn't anymore. In the cabin, a tremor ran through people who didn't know the words but understood the music of danger. Heads jerked toward windows. Eyes found the left wing and saw a shape they would remember forever. Flight attendants moved with the purposeful grace of people who choose, even here, to be useful. Somewhere, a child asked a question that no one answered. The cockpit did what good cockpits do. It focused. Captain Lux and First Officer Dillard worked the problem they believed they had, loss of an engine, and traded the kind of tight, low words that professionals use when seconds have become currency. But the stall warning that might have insisted on a different course, the light that would have tattled on the treacherous slats, those were among the instruments that went quiet when the left engine ripped away. It was as if the airplane had not just lost muscle, but parts of its nervous system and voice. Climb becomes drift, drift becomes sink, and then the left wing, overworked, underlifted, gives up. The DC-10 rolls, not the gentle banking of an aircraft turning for the horizon, but a brutal, involuntary rotation that drags the whole world sideways. The ground rises at an angle that human bodies are not built to see through windows. In the tiny universes of seats and armrests, hands find hands, prayers come out in whispers and gasps, and 1,000 personal histories pull tight around a single terrible present. Impact turns air to earth and fuel to fire. The field beyond the runway answers with a blast and a bloom of black smoke that knots the sky. First responders race toward what they have always trained for and never truly seen. There is no corridor for miracles here, only heat, shards, and an abrupt, unforgiving end. On the ground, 2 more lives are taken. The number becomes a hard, round thing people will repeat for decades because there are no soft numbers for this. 273. And then the hush that often follows the loudest things. Investigators step into that hush with tape measures, cameras, and a patience that borders on reverence. They begin the census of ruin, cataloguing fragments, mapping where the engine traveled, reading scorch and shear like a second language. Wreckage is a storyteller, if you're willing to listen long enough. In the remains of the left wing and the scars along its route, the investigators find an argument written in bent metal and torn fittings. They follow it backward in time, past the fire, past the moment of separation, past the day's checklists, into a hangar months before where a choice was made. The manufacturer's manual said the safe way to remove a DC-10 engine was to separate the engine from its pylon and then remove the pylon from the wing. It was a 2-act play with props designed for each step. But American Airlines, looking for efficiency and standardizing across fleets, had adopted a different method, taking the engine and pylon off together. Done with exquisite care and the right equipment, it could save hours. Done with a forklift under a pylon that demanded micrometer-level finesse, it could introduce damage so subtle you wouldn't hear it until the airplane shouted. Imagine the scene the investigators reconstructed. a forklift's mast nudging up under a complex curved piece of steel, the weight of an engine balanced against human hands and verbal cues. A fraction of an inch out of line, and the aft pylon mount endures a load it was never meant to carry while being jostled free. A tiny crack begins there, a private fissure in a place where stress likes to congregate. Painted over, inspected but not seen, it waits, patient and undemanding, the way metal floors are. The day Flight 191 rolls down the runway, vibration and force add the last demands. The crack needs to become a break, the break becomes separation, and separation becomes catastrophe. The secret in these ruins is not the guilty thrill of a mystery solved. It's the quieter, colder revelation that systems we trust can be undermined by small human shortcuts, and that oversight can miss the most expensive inch in the world. Manuals exist because they memorialize pain, and when we deviate from them, we inherit their risks. The DC-10 would be grounded across the country in the weeks after the crash, its type certificate briefly suspended while regulators and engineers revisited what they had believed about doors and pylons and slats and redundancy. Airlines would review maintenance procedures. Forklifts would give way to fixtures designed to cradle and align with the gentleness heavy machinery deserves. The airplane did not just kill, it taught. But there is another ledger being kept, one that doesn't balance with bulletins, service directives, or redesigns. It belongs to the families who stood at fences, gripping chain link until their knuckles whitened, to the firefighters who took the smoke home in their hair, to the controllers who replayed the tape until the tape dissolved into the grooves of their nights. The afterlife of a disaster spreads like rings on water. Memorials, anniversaries, names that become place names. It spares almost no one connected to it. All are drafted into a community that would rather not exist. When people speak about Flight 191 now, their voices carry something hard to name. Survivors of loss learn new vocabularies. Pylon, slat, stall speed, attach fitting. They learn that airplanes have bones and nerves, and that the difference between safe and doomed can be the thickness of a fingernail in the wrong place. They learn that routine is only the absence of visible risk, not its absence altogether. And yet amid the anger there is gratitude for the dull heroism of those who refuse to let wreckage be simply wreckage, who turn fields of debris into textbooks and new training and different choices. Stand in that field in your mind for a moment after the last siren fades. The grass eventually returns. The blackened dirt loses its color and then its smell. But dig your hand an inch and you feel it. The story metal tells when we finally quiet down enough to hear it. Flight 191's lesson is as bare and unavoidable as a stripped thread. Take nothing for granted. Not the bolt you can't see, not the procedure that saves time, not the instrument you assume will speak when it is ripped from its voice. We are clever and we are careless. Aviation is the place where those two truths keep meeting, and where the only honorable response is to be more clever and less careless tomorrow than we were yesterday. The wreckage is long gone from that field. The secret it offered remains. Disasters are the invoices for our assumptions. We pay them once in lives, and then, if we are worthy, we pay them forever in attention. The thunderheads over North Texas showed themselves like monuments, high white fortresses with bruised bellies. From a distance they were beautiful in that way. Dangerous things are before you get close enough to be humbled. Delta Airlines, Flight 191, an L-1011 TriStar inbound from Fort Lauderdale with onward service to Los Angeles, turned toward Dallas-Fort Worth in late-day light that flickered between gold and the green of coming rain. Inside, travelers loosened belts, folded newspapers, rehearsed greetings for a baggage claim that now seemed certain. On the flight deck, a veteran crew traced the approach with the ease of repetition. The airplane's weather radar painted thick returns, a pulsing green to red geometry that told you where the worst water was, but not what the air was planning to do. That was the blind spot of the era. You could see rain. You could not see the invisible violence falling through it. Over the final minutes, the cockpit's focus narrowed, as it does for every crew, into a choreography of call-outs, altitudes and needles settling where they belong. Ahead, a rain shaft hung from a thunderstorm like a grey curtain, opaque in places, beaded in others, lightning stitched along the edges, windshield wipers clicked. The tower spoke in clipped syllables that tried to square safety with the unavoidable fact that airplanes cannot all wait for perfect weather. The decision to continue was not reckless, it was ordinary. Ordinary has teeth when the sky is holding a secret. The first clue was kindness. A sudden, welcome push of headwind that fattened the airspeed tape and made the approach feel buoyant. Pilots like headwinds on final. They make wings more honest. Power eased back a hair, pitch relaxed. A breath later came the second clue, a weight no one invites, downdraft. It was like stepping onto a stair that isn't there. Descent rate ticked up sharply. Power came in. A third clue followed hard. The headwind flipped to tailwind, snatching lift the way a rip current steals footing. Engines spooled, big fans with heavy blades asking for seconds the airplane didn't have. The L-1011, an airplane famous for its manners, suddenly felt like it had been shouldered hard by something impolite and invisible. In the cabin, time changed texture. The sound of rain against aluminum grew loud enough to be a thing by itself. Faces turned to the windows and saw only water and a smear of lights. Flight attendants braced with one hand and reached with the other, doing the old, brave work of saying steady words that held strangers together. In the cockpit, the needles began to wander and the ground proximity system started its flat, insistent sermon. Wind shear was not yet a household phrase. In that moment, it was a pressure on chests and a deepening angle through rain. Short of the runway, the TriStar dropped through the bottom of the microburst. The left wing clipped a car on Highway 114, an ordinary commute intersecting a chain of physics, and moments later, the airplane struck an open field, careened into the approach lights, then broke and burned near water tanks that had been part of the airport's scenery for years. Fire rose into the storm as if the sky had decided to answer itself with flame. And then, as always, there were people. Survivors crawled out into steam and downpour, the air full of jet fuel and wet earth. First responders, already soaked by the storm, ran into heat that made rain hiss. A flight attendant with burned hands guided people away from the wreckage by voice, because hands can fail before voices do. A passenger dazed and bleeding went back twice for strangers he could not later name. Somewhere nearby, the driver whose route crossed the glide path did not go home. Tragedy rarely keeps its circles neat. What the wreckage hid, what investigators had to coax from it with a careful mix of science and patience, was a pattern that did not look like classic pilot error or broken hardware. The flight data recorder told a story in numbers anyone can learn to read. An approach stabilized until it wasn't, airspeed spiking with headwind, then bleeding off under a tailwind, vertical acceleration dropping as the downdraft took hold, engines coming to full just as the ground arrived first. The cockpit voice recorder offered the human counterpoint, call-outs, corrections, the moment hope turns into work, then into a ride. No one is flying so much as surviving. Frames of mangled metal traced a path that matched radar, lightning, and rainfall. The field itself testified. Grass laid flat in a starburst pattern, debris scattered in ways that drew arrows across maps. All of it converged on a culprit that leaves fingerprints only when you know where to dust: microburst-induced wind shear. In earlier years, the concept had been controversial outside a small weather circle. Strong, localized downdrafts slamming into the ground and splashing outward in rings of destructive wind. It sounded like a cautionary metaphor until you ran your palm across steel curled the wrong way. The survey teams walked the crash site with the patience of gardeners and the intensity of detectives. They traced the flow lines of the storm's outflow through toppled signs and bent trees, the way investigators of older eras followed blood spatter and tire tracks. The airplane's bones lined up with the sky's physics until the picture was too coherent to deny. That was the secret buried in the wreckage, a killer that nobody could see and that most cockpits of the time could not name in real time. The airplane hadn't failed. The people hadn't quit. A storm had thrown down a challenge timed to the half-second, and the tools on board were built for the wrong kind of fight. What came next is how aviation says its prayers. Airports expanded low-level wind shear alert systems around runways so that outflow boundaries and gust fronts would trigger alarms instead of autopsies. Training syllabi changed worldwide. Crews began living through microbursts in simulators, feeling that fake, ugly sequence, headwind gift, downdraft punch, tailwind theft, until muscle memory had opinions. Manufacturers added predictive wind shear to weather radars, look-ahead logic that watches for the Doppler whisper of air moving the wrong way so the airplane can warn before the trap is sprung. Procedures hardened too. A philosophy of go around earlier, deviate wider, believe the cloud when it looks like certain shapes, and refuse runways whose approach paths are painted with rain shafts and electricity. Families and survivors wrote different outcomes into the world as well. Memorial trees that grow through Texas heat, a service every year where names sound like bells, scholarships, foundations, community acts that insist grief must plant something. First responders carry the storm scent long after, and controllers hear static in empty rooms sometimes. That is part of the cost the public doesn't see. But the ledger moved. Flights skim storm edges now with more suspicion than swagger. What used to be called pressing on is increasingly called not today. Stand at the site in your mind when the rain finally leaves. The field looks ordinary again. A road humming with traffic, fence lines straightened, the airport's geometry continuing its ancient bargain with gravity. But the air remembers, and so do the checklists. The lesson is simple and hard. Not all threats are mass or metal. Some are differences in air you cannot taste until they're already in your lungs. That invisibility is what made the wind so frightening. And it is what made the investigation's slow, careful naming of it feel like a kind of exorcism. The story of Flight 191 is not that storms are bad. It is that we are better at respecting them now. The wreckage gave us a map from arrogance to humility, from radar pictures to wind pictures, from looks fine to what's it doing near the ground. The TriStar's last minutes are taught so that strangers who will never know each other can arrive at baggage belts dry and bored. That is the quiet victory of aviation, to turn terror into tedium for someone else. When the sky over Dallas cracks with lightning in August, you can almost imagine the old outflows marching at ground level, feeling for a wing. But the airport answers with sensors, training, and different choices, born of a day when a beautiful airplane met a merciless physics test. The secret is not hidden anymore. We wrote it down in procedures and radar code, and we underline it whenever a crew speaks up early and turns away. The night over the Everglades had that winter clarity Florida sometimes gives you. Stars like cold pinholes, air so clean it feels new. Eastern Airlines. Flight 401, a nearly brand new L-1011 TriStar, descended toward Miami with the relaxed cadence of a crew heading for the end of a long day. Captain Robert Bob Loft sat easy in the left seat. First Officer Albert Stockstill, precise and steady, managed the approach. Flight Engineer Donald Repo kept the TriStar's new technology humming. In the cabin, holiday travelers traded plans for New Year's. A few babies slept, and the aisle was a quiet river of small mercies. Blankets, water, smiles, gear down, flaps. The checklist clicked forward like a well-oiled lock, until it didn't. The nose gear, down and locked indicator stayed dark. One tiny bulb, the size of a fingertip, refused to glow. The gear lever had the right feel. There was no vibration or yaw to suggest a hidden snag. But lights matter in cockpits the way words matter in vows. They're not everything, but their absence can unmake certainty. Loft called for a go-around and asked for the hold. Miami approach granted it, and the TriStar climbed away from the runway lights into a black that was more swamp than sky. At 2,000 feet level, the airplane traced a lazy racetrack over the Everglades. In the cockpit, 3 professionals turned into watchmakers. The first officer and captain pressed, twisted, and reseated the offending bulb. The flight engineer dropped down into the electronics bay, the hellhole, to peer through a small sight port and confirm with his own eyes whether the nose gear was actually extended. This was a new kind of cockpit, screens and automation, modes and submodes, and its generosity hid a trap. The autopilot, set to hold altitude, could be nudged into control wheel steering if someone applied pressure to the yoke. A bump, a brace, a wrist leaning just a touch too long. The machine would politely relinquish its promise to keep the wings carving level air and instead follow the pilot's hand, quiet as a rumor. No horn announced the shift, no light tattled. The TriStar would simply begin doing exactly what physics asked of an airplane left to itself. In thin, dark air, it would descend. Inside the cockpit, attention had tunneled around the tiny, stubborn darkness of a lamp. Stockstill asked for the bulb. Loft tried to replace it. Repo, chest against metal, called up what he could see. Nobody in that minute was lazy or uncaring. They were thorough, so thorough that their collective vision narrowed to a single point of light that refused to exist. The altimeter's steady guardians ticked downward. A chime sounded and was absorbed by the business at hand. Outside the windows, nothing but black on black. The Everglades a perfect accomplice for a quiet mistake. A controller asked their altitude. 2,000, came the reply, ears hearing what the brain expected. Seconds bled. The TriStar's sink rate grew from barely there to undeniable. Stockstill, finally, saw it. "We're still at 2,000, right?" he asked, a sentence half question, half self-correction. "Hey, what's happening here?" The last word was barely out when the world answered. The impact was more like a shove from a giant than a crash. The soft, wet knife of the swamp receiving metal at high speed. The L-1011 broke, skipped, and came apart across sawgrass and black water, its beautiful systems turning to sharp edges in the dark. Fuel atomized. Fire drew lines across the night and then fell back, smothered by mud and water. In the cabin, time forked. For some it ended cleanly, for others it extended into a brutal physics problem of belts and angles, of smoke and water, and the kind of pain that insists on being noticed. And then, voices. The sound of survivors is always a strange high music. Names shouted into absence, instructions with no authority but need. People stood waist-deep on torn floor sections like rafts, their breath showing in the winter air. Others swam through a soup of silt and aviation. Flight attendants, broken and bleeding, did the unthinkable simple things, counted, called, pointed, pulled. Somewhere in that soaked blackness, a baby cried and then, because miracles sometimes keep their own counsel, kept crying. Airboats, summoned by radio and rumor, skimmed toward the glow. Men who knew the swamp better than the highway arrived with ropes and hands and the kind of steadiness that is a profession on its own. When the fires cooled, investigators stepped into a landscape that did not want them. The Everglades is not a field or a hillside. It is a moving, breathing sheet of water that hides evidence, like a cunning story hides its reveals. Teams wore hip waders, fought muck that wanted to make a meal of their boots, and mapped a debris field by floodlight and patience. They recovered recorders with the care usually reserved for infants. They traced wires that ended in torn looms. They lifted a landing gear assembly that had, in fact, been down and locked all along. In the lab, the failed lamp lit the first time it saw current, proof that the original bulb had been fine, that seating and sockets had played a trick. The light had lied because the connection was shy, not because the gear was. The data told a story both dumbfounding and ordinary. The autopilot had slipped into a mode that stopped holding altitude after a likely tiny bump on the yoke. No malice, no intent, just hardware trying to be helpful and humans asking it inadvertently to be something else. The altimeters had not bugged out. They had been ignored in service of what seemed like a more urgent task. The crew were not careless. They were captured, caught by a single point of failure psychology. The problem you can see becomes the universe, and the universe you can't see, vertical speed in the dark over a featureless swamp, shrinks to nothing. The recorder's last exchanges, measured then puzzled, read like a parable of focus and its blind spots. That was the secret in the Everglades. Our brains, which save us all day, can betray us at night when a tiny lamp is allowed to become the sun. Technology, which offers gifts, can choose silence at the wrong moment, and black water will keep your secrets if you try to tell them too late. What followed shaped cockpits. Crew resource management, a phrase barely born, began to grow teeth. Checklists and training emphasized division of attention. One person flies the airplane, always. The others can wrestle the gremlins. Mode awareness, knowing exactly what your automation thinks it's doing, became liturgy. Designers tweaked enunciations, refined guards against easy reversion into misleading modes. The L-1011's elegance was not the villain. The villain was a moment when the machine and its masters stopped talking honestly to each other. In the human ledger, the entries were heavier and stranger. Survivors carried swamp water in their dreams. Rescuers remembered the weight of soaked clothing, the burn of jet fuel on skin, the effort it takes to lift a person through the small geometry of broken seats. Families built an anniversary into their years, the way you place a stone on a mantle and touch it when you pass. And then there were the stories, unofficial, insistent, about parts salvaged from the wreck and installed in other TriStars, and of cockpit apparitions that asked whether checks had been completed, whether gear was down. Most airlines don't keep ghosts in maintenance logs, but humans do. Whether you believe in such visitations or not, the fact those tales found audiences says something true. A lesson wanted to live in memory so stubbornly that people gave it a face and a voice. Stand in that darkness again in your mind, the airboat's engines idling now, the stars reasserting themselves after the smoke has thinned. Somewhere under 6 feet of water and mud sits a bulb that never mattered as much as it seemed to, and next to it, the shape of a switch that meant more than anyone gave it credit for. The Everglades is good at erasing footprints, but it could not erase the imprint this left on aviation. Every time a captain says, "I'll fly," keep troubleshooting. Every time a pilot glances one more time at an altimeter when something else is yelling for attention, you can hear a quiet echo of this night. There is a tenderness, too, in how the story refuses to be only a lesson. It is also a roll call of small braveries. A flight attendant with a broken arm counting souls by voice, a fisherman who waded chest deep with a flashlight in his teeth, a controller who kept his own voice even when his gut had already guessed. If the light lied, people didn't. Their work was the antidote, the correction written in muscle and will. When the sky over Miami is winter clear and the air smells like wet grass and salt, it's easy to imagine the TriStar's green position lights moving across that same darkness, holding level, turning toward home. In a way, it still does. In the procedures, in the training, in the stubborn cultural memory that says, fly the airplane first. The Wreckage's last whisper is simple, and it is generous. Attention is a finite fuel. Spend it where gravity lives. The summer evening over Long Island had that humid softness New York wears in July. Salt in the air, blue that lingers even after the sun is gone. At John F. Kennedy International, Constellation Row glowed as if the gates themselves were holding their breath. TWA Flight 800, a Boeing 747-100 bound for Paris, taxied with the stately patience of a ship leaving harbor. In the cockpit, Captain Ralph Kevorkian, First Officer Stephen Snyder, and Flight Engineer Richard Campbell moved through checklists with the measured cadence of professionals who have made complicated things look ordinary for a lifetime. A young flight engineer in training, Oliver Crick, was there to learn what smooth looks like from the inside. Along the aisles, it was the human catalogue of a transatlantic night flight. Teenagers trading seats so they could sit together. A grandmother smoothing a boarding pass until it was soft as cloth. Honeymooners buzzing with a private electricity. A businessman turning a paper itinerary into a stack of tomorrow's plans. Flight attendants offered the choreography of reassurance. Bags here, belts there, a hand on a shoulder just long enough to say, "You can relax now." TWA 800 rolled, turned, and lifted into a sky that still held the day's last heat. Far below, the barrier beaches stretched like punctuation marks along the Atlantic. Boats dawdled near shore, their running lights blinking patient Morse. People stood on decks and docks and sand and watched airplanes draw clean lines toward the horizon. 12 minutes after takeoff, that line became a wound. Witnesses would later describe a streak, a flare, a blossom of light. The 747's midsection tore open with an energy that made its own weather. The cockpit separated, the forward fuselage rolled skyward, the center fell in burning fragments. The sea took what the sky let go. Onshore, phones rang and then rang again. Coast Guard, volunteer firehouses, people who had just seen something they could not name and did not want to be true. Out at sea, fishermen turned toward heat and smoke, because that is what people do when the night shows them a fire on the water. There were no survivors. The ocean became a search grid bordered by grief. Helicopters skimmed the low, dark, winch cables touched water, and divers dropped into a night that clenched tight, even around flashlights. The recovery would go on for months, hands groping through cold silt for small, terrible truths. On land, a cavernous hangar in Calverton slowly filled with wreckage that had been catalogued like a library. From twisted frames and scorched skins, the airplane's skeleton reassembled, a ghost rising under fluorescent lights. You could walk around that reconstructed fuselage and feel it, the dignity of an investigation that refuses to look away. The first story to arrive was fears. Was it a missile? Sabotage? The FBI opened a parallel path because one must when the sky brightens like that near a city. Eyewitness accounts, dozens of them, painted the kind of contradictory collage that human perception makes under stress. Those testimonies were not laughed at. They were honored and tested, laid alongside mathematics and radar plots and blast patterns. As weeks stretched into months, the wreckage, the mute witness that does not forget, kept whispering the same thing. Look at the center. Technicians traced soot and blistering back to the center wing tank, CWT, a volume of space above the main landing gear bays, normally filled with fuel on long flights and only a shallow puddle on shorter ones. That night, there was little fuel inside, a few inches sloshing across the bottom, vapor above it warmed by the air conditioning packs mounted just below. Those packs had been running at the gate to keep the cabin tolerable in the July heat, radiating through structure into the tank, turning liquid into fumes. In the right mood, kerosene vapor is not fuel, it is invitation. Ignition sources inside fuel tanks are not supposed to exist, yet when investigators followed the wiring harnesses, sheathed and routed through ribs and spaces and years, they found a plausible path. Power from elsewhere, a frayed spot, a chafe, a short that let voltage dance where only millivolts should live. Enough, perhaps, to make a spark at the fuel quantity indication system. The metal around the tank told the same tale. Skin panels peeled outward like petals, fasteners bent the wrong way, fracture lines curved as shock traced a path from inside to out. Radar tapes and flight data converged. The FBI stood down. The NTSB kept going, not to punish, but to understand. Meanwhile, the families, the true center of every investigation, lived in waiting rooms, churches, and kitchens that had become offices. They learned the language of technical grief, center wing tank, FQIS, inerting, chafed insulation. They held each other up through vigils and press conferences, and the way the calendar betrays you, by not stopping. They visited the hangar where their loved one's plane had become an anatomy lesson and found, amid the bolts and tags, the careful humanity of investigators who knew they were handling more than aluminum. In that hangar, you could also feel a second story settling into place. This was not malevolence from outside, it was entropy from within. Wires age. Heat finds the wrong places. Design assumptions meet climates they only partly anticipated. Several factors conspired. A hot New York afternoon, a taxi delay with packs running, a nearly empty tank, a system never intended to be intrinsically safe in explosive atmospheres. No one thing was monstrous. Together, they were. The secret buried in these fragments was the quiet tyranny of the ordinary. A 747 was not felled by villains or zero-day failures, but by the kind of coupling we forget to fear. Flammable vapor plus heat plus a spark that shouldn't be there. The remedy, once you admit that, is both mundane and profound. If you cannot guarantee the absence of sparks, make the air unignitable. If you cannot fully trust decades-old wiring everywhere, change the environment so its mistakes don't matter as much. The industry turned toward fuel tank inerting, pushing nitrogen into the space above the fuel to starve any spark before it has a chance to make an announcement. Engineers re-examined wire bundles with the suspicious eye of someone who knows time is a vandal. Airlines and regulators reviewed maintenance practices and rerouted, shielded and separated where they could. Training and documents were salted with a new respect for heat under tanks and the deceptive safety of almost empty. On Long Island, the water gave back many of its secrets. Nearly the entire aircraft was raised, labeled and placed with a tenderness that machinery rarely receives. People walked by the rebuilt sidewalls and touched them with fingertips, as if the cold metal might confess something more if met with skin. It didn't. It had already said enough. What remains after the technical correction and the procedural amendments and the engineering that now hums quietly on flights you and I board without a second thought is a human ledger with a different kind of math. There is the memorial at Smith Point, where a garden opens to the sea and the wind says the names. There are the families who became reluctant experts and then advocates, who turned a personal abyss into public safety with a stubbornness that looks like love in motion. There are divers who still dream of a green-black world where light from the surface arrives in broken coins. There are controllers who glance out at the evening departures and think, just for a moment, of a night when the line went wrong. Stand on the beach at dusk, the kind of July dusk that smells like sunscreen and fry oil and ocean. The jetways on the far horizon draw their careful arcs into the dark. You can imagine one of those arcs flaring and then extinguishing, and your chest tightens in reflex. Then you remember what the hangar taught and what the procedures now preach. That we learned something costly and we refuse to let the cost be paid twice. Every hiss of a nitrogen-generating system mixing with fuel tank air, every hand that tapes and ties and routes wiring with suspicious care, is a quiet reply to that night. The Wreckage's last message is not even about airplanes. It is about the way ordinary ingredients can conspire when left unsupervised, and about the discipline of imagining coincidences before they happen to you. A spark is a small thing if you have already drained the room of breath. Failing that, you learn to listen for the soft sounds, the buzz you should not hear, the warmth where cold belongs, and you learn to distrust the phrase, "It's probably fine." On paper, TWA 800 is a case file closed and a cause determined. In the lives it altered, it is a weather system that never fully leaves. Yet the sky is busier and safer now because a team of people took shards of aluminum and threads of wire and wrote a new margin into the story of flight. That is the strangest grace of aviation, that ruin can become a blueprint, and that grief, given enough stubbornness, can be converted into distance traveled without fear. South Florida does a particular kind of Saturday, sun baked onto asphalt. Heat lifting in shimmers, thunderheads building far inland, like white mountains that won't arrive until evening. ValuJet Flight 592, a DC-9 bound for Atlanta, pushed back from Miami with the thrift and hustle rhythm of a young, fast-growing airline. The cabin was full of weekend itineraries and the tired happiness of people who'd already had their beach day. In the cockpit, Captain Candy Kubek and First Officer Richard Hazen moved through the flows with the tidy cadence of professionals who had learned to make speed look like calm. Beneath their feet in the forward cargo hold, Class D by regulation, were cardboard boxes and a few aircraft tires. The paperwork said the boxes were company material. Inside them, packed by a contracted maintenance shop, were dozens upon dozens of chemical oxygen generators, small metal canisters designed to feed masks with life when a cabin loses its breath. These weren't empty, some were expired. Many had no safety caps. They were not declared as hazardous. They should never have been here. The DC-9 climbed. Sun glazed the wing. Miami fell behind in rectangles of blue pool and white roof. Less than 10 minutes after takeoff, the first warning arrived. Not on a panel, but through human senses. A muffled thump. A smell like hot metal and something chemical. Then smoke, thin and questioning at first, then bold, pushing up from the floor at the feet of passengers seated over the forward hold. Flight attendants went to work with the kind of economy you only see when people know their job, can't afford wasted motion. Check the galley, open the lav, call the cockpit, calm the eyes that are starting to widen. Smoke in the cabin, the interphone said. In the cockpit, a turn back, a mayday, vectors to runway 12. The DC-9 began a descending left arc toward the airport they could see hazy in the heat. The checklists did not have an easy page for fire you cannot reach. The Class D design assumed that a cargo fire would starve itself of oxygen. Smoke detectors and suppression weren't required. But the fire below was not ordinary. The oxygen generators, activated by jostle and heat, were feeding pure O2, turning the dark compartment into a furnace that didn't need the airplane's air to breathe. Rubber tires added their own black encouragement. In the cabin, smoke thickened from fog to wall. Passengers coughed, shouted, reached for anything that meant direction. A flight attendant, eyes burning, crawled along the aisle to stay below the worst of it, counting rows by touch, putting hands on shoulders and words into ears. We're turning back. The lights seemed dimmer, the air felt wrong. A baby cried in that staccato way that means breath is expensive. On the flight deck, the situation turned from hard to knife edge. Systems failed in ugly succession. Electrical buses flickered, then dropped. Flight instruments that had been steady got noisy. Control cable runs routed near the forward hold began to feel the heat. The crew fought a punishing set of cross-checks, flying an already busy return while monitoring a cabin that was disappearing behind smoke. The CVR would capture the bluntness of the moment, declarations, then the raw human sound of people trying to make an airplane obey when parts of it are being unmade. "We're losing it," a voice says. The nose lowered more than anyone would ever choose. Out the windows, green, the Everglades again, flat, glittering, deceptive in its calm. Seconds remained. The DC-9 descended in a shallow, accelerating dive, engine noise rising against a background of alarms that had begun to overlap into a single scalding tone. There was no runway left in the geometry of hope, only distance and swamp. Impact drove the airplane into the water and peat with such force that the wreckage shattered into small fragments and a mist of debris that settled like bad weather over sawgrass. There were no survivors. Recovery in that place is a test of patience and reverence. Airboats cut slow figure eights through a soup of soil and water that smelled like old leaves and burned things. Deputies and firefighters worked in lines, faces set, hands blackened. Investigators wore rubber boots that vanished into mud within steps. They did not find large sections of airplane to clamber over. They found shards, tags, and a map that had to be assembled in minds first and then painfully on tables. In the hangars and labs, the story cohered. Class D compartments were meant to suffocate fire, but oxygen generators do not accept the premise. A generator is a sealed chemistry experiment. Pull the firing pin and sodium chlorate and iron powder react, producing minutes of hot oxygen. Safety caps prevent accidental activation and protect the igniters. Many caps were missing. Some lanyards had been taped in place. The boxes bore the wrong labels. A maintenance contractor, Sabertech, had gathered expired units from aircraft, and rather than discharging or capping them, packaged and shipped them as if they were inert scrap. ValuJet's acceptance of those boxes, its processes, training, and oversight failed to recognize the danger. Paperwork called them oxygen canisters empty. They were not. The burn signatures inside the cargo hold told their part. Distinctive white-grey deposits, metals softened, then bubbled, alloys discolored in ways that only oxygen-rich fire will confess. Wiring looms routed overhead showed melting and shorts that explained the electrical chaos on the flight deck. Control system components in the forward belly area, cables, pulleys, pressure bulkheads showed heat damage consistent with a fast, inextinguishable blaze. The terrifying efficiency of the timeline, smoke reported at 2:10 p.m., impact at 2:13, matched a cargo-fed fire that outran human procedures. That was the secret in these ruins. Fire behaves like a different element when fed by oxygen it brings with it. The compartment design, the regulations, the checklists, all had assumed a certain physics. The boxes rewrote it. The ledger of accountability widened. The NTSB named cause and contributors with the cool grammar of engineering. The fire originated with chemical oxygen generators improperly carried as cargo. Sabertech's failures in maintenance, documentation, and training were causal. ValuJet's inadequate oversight of its contractor and acceptance procedures contributed. FAA oversight of a rapidly expanding low-cost carrier and of cargo compartment safety requirements was insufficient. In courtrooms and hearings, those sentences took on heat. Sabertech would face criminal charges, fines would be levied, licenses would be scrutinized. ValuJet, bruised in public trust and grounded for a time, would later merge into Airtran. But the most important arguments happened in the Federal Register and the design offices. Class D cargo compartments, those quiet boxes under your feet, were effectively legislated out of existence on passenger airplanes. Detection and suppression became compulsory. Halon bottles and sensors took up residence where assumptions had lived. Hazardous materials training was rewritten so that company material could no longer be a magic phrase that made risk disappear. Oxygen generators moved under stricter handling, shipping, and disposal rules. Caps and pins stopped being suggestions. Airlines tightened vendor oversight, the unglamorous work that saves lives. On safety posters and in computer-based training, a photo of a small silver canister began to stand for the idea that it's not the size of a thing that makes it dangerous, it's the chemistry and the context. Meanwhile, the human ledgers began a long, uneven settling. Families looked out over sawgrass that had never heard of them until the day it took everything. Memorials rose, quiet places where names are held above water that can't drown memory. First responders carried the weight of a site that gives back so little that closure becomes an act of will. Investigators went home from long days smelling of fuel and earth, knowing they would spend years explaining to strangers why boxes matter. If you stand, in your imagination, above that patch of the Everglades at noon, the sun is blinding and the air is heavy. You cannot see any trace from the sky now. The grass remembers only in the way a field remembers weather. But in every cargo bay on every airliner, small red caps, placards, sensors, and extinguisher bottles are quiet monuments to 592. So is a clerk who refuses a box with a wrong label, a mechanic who insists on discharging before shipping, a captain who wants to know exactly what company material really means. The Wreckage's message is sparse and stern. Never bet your life on paperwork that flatters reality. Know what's inside the box. Assume there is a way for ordinary objects to become engines of harm if you give them the right or wrong companions. Fire moves faster than procedure. The only winning play is to deny it the ingredients before it starts. In aviation, that has become doctrine, paid for by people who boarded a routine flight and never returned. In the years since, departures from Miami still climb over that bright green map toward the north. You can watch a DC-9's descendants arc past afternoon storms and feel the small, earned comfort of systems that now watch the dark spaces under the floor. On some level, every passenger is protected by strangers they'll never meet. Regulators who argued commas into sentences, technicians who cap canisters, ramp workers who flag what doesn't look right. That is how aviation answers its worst days, with a long tail of quiet, stubborn competence. And yet, inside the competence, the story stays tender. A child who lost a parent in 592 might be an adult now, finding their way to the memorial anyway, because grief bleeds across calendars. A firefighter will always remember the feel of peat that wouldn't let boots go. A flight attendant who reads the smoke checklist today hears in the back of their mind a single imperative that 592 wrote in permanent ink. Move faster, believe your nose, turn back hard. The box is burned. We learned. The price was unacceptable. The only redemption is that we stopped charging it again. Late afternoon off the California coast, the Pacific looked sheet metal smooth, gray-blue and mindless. Alaska Airlines Flight 261, an MD-83 heading from Puerto Vallarta towards San Francisco and Seattle, rode that cold air north with a cabin full of sunburned vacations and the soft fatigue that follows happy days. In the cockpit, Captain Ted Thompson and First Officer Bill Tansky worked like a matched pair, seasoned, calm, voices even. Far ahead, the Channel Islands were a dark braid on the horizon. Los Angeles lay beyond, a place to divert to if a small problem ever tried to be a big one. The first hints were tiny. The airplane needed more trim than usual to hold its nose where the pilots wanted it. Thompson and Tansky tried the electric pitch trim. It hesitated, then balked. They tried the alternate system. Same story. Jammed stabilizer, they told each other aloud, putting a name to the feeling every pilot knows from simulator days but hopes never to meet. The horizontal stabilizer in the tail refusing to move, locking pitch where physics, not preference, decides. They did what good crews do, asked for a block of altitude, told ATC they were working a flight control problem, and began troubleshooting. Checklists came out. Procedures that lived mostly on paper were summoned for real. The MD-80 series had a stabilizer breakout technique, unloading the tail and attempting to free the jam with specific airspeeds and control inputs. They tried it. For a heartbeat, the jam seemed to give. Then it didn't. They leveled, held what they had, and turned toward Los Angeles. Calm voices, methodical hands. Passengers felt only a slow seesaw. Climb, settle, climb. Flight attendants walked the aisle with that purposeful look that says nothing is wrong and everything is being handled. A child pointed at the water. Someone laughed at a vacation photo on a tiny camera screen. The airplane, dignified even when annoyed, kept its own counsel. Minutes later, the airplane changed the conversation. A deep shudder ran through the tail. The nose pitched down hard, as if the sky had been yanked away. Alarms woke up in a chorus nobody wants. The MD-83 rolled and dove, ocean rushing up the windshield. In the cockpit, the pilots hauled, powered, fought, turning a fall into a shape with edges. The jet rolled fully inverted, belly to the sky, and, astonishingly, Thompson and Tansky got a measure of control back upside down. They were flying an airplane that no longer understood upright. Voices on the radio were steady in a way that makes your throat hurt to hear later. They asked for vectors. They told ATC they were inverted. They aimed for Los Angeles because hope prefers runways. For a long handful of seconds, the impossible looked negotiable. Then the tail shuddered again, control bled away, and the MD-83 tipped into a final accelerating dive. The Pacific took 88 souls and kept them. The ocean does not invite investigation, but it does not forbid it either. Recovery crews worked from ships and barges under a winter sky. Divers moved through cold green water where silt swallows light. The wreckage rose in slings and baskets, panels, ribs, sections of floor shaped like rooms that no longer existed. In a hangar, tables filled with tagged fragments until the tail surfaces, what mattered most, could be laid out and stared at for as long as it took. What they needed to know lived inside a simple assembly with a baleful job title, the horizontal stabilizer trim jackscrew and its Acme nut. The jackscrew is a long threaded rod that runs through a matching nut fixed to the airplane. When motors turn the screw, the stabilizer pivots for trim. When the screw is still, the Acme nut's threads hold the whole tailplane in place against aerodynamic load. The elegance is in the simplicity. No hydraulics, no exotic magic, just threads holding the sky. Those threads were gone. Under magnification, the Acme nut's female threads, soft metal designed to wear first and be replaced, weren't sheared off in one violent moment. They had been consumed over time. The last few turns had stripped under load, letting the screw jump the tracks. Once the threads were gone, there was nothing left to keep the stabilizer from freewheeling nose down under aerodynamic force. The brief recovery inverted made awful sense. With the airplane upside down, gravity and load direction changed just enough to let the pilots claw back a sliver of control until the tail shifted again. Investigators traced the wear backward into maintenance, lubrication intervals that had been extended, end play measurements, a way to gauge wear by checking how much the jackscrew can move, that had been recorded as in limits. Documentation that looked fine but could be wrong if the measuring technique or reference values were off by millimeters, that matter. Grease matters here. Not just its presence, but the right kind, the right amount, delivered where threads meet. Without it, metal rubs metal, and metal loses. The airplane had flown hard service. The component had quietly aged into danger. In interview rooms and hearing halls, a granular picture formed. Alaska Airlines had pushed to lengthen intervals between deep maintenance tasks, a common industry impulse that demands rigor to stay safe. Procedures for the end-play check required precise setups that busy lines can distort if training is thin or supervision lacks. 2 entries that said "within limits" could hide a trend if nobody stepped back to see the slope. Paper approved what physics was slowly refusing. None of that lived in the cockpit on the day. Thompson and Tansky worked the problem they had with grace. Calm calls, clean division of duties, a refusal to panic. The CVR would show them delegating to each other and to the checklists even when gravity tried to erase the flaw. Flight attendants in the cabin, faces turned grey by fear and smoke and effort, kept voices level. Passengers held hands. The sea waited. The secret in this wreckage wasn't a cult. It was terrifying precisely because it was ordinary. A screw that should have been greased, a measurement that should have been skeptical, an interval that should have been conservative. The jackscrew is humble hardware. Humility failed it. The answers that followed were not theatrical, but they were stern. Lubrication intervals for MD-80 series stabilizer jackscrews were tightened. End-play checks were clarified with methods and tolerances that left less room for optimistic interpretation. Oversight of extended interval programs grew teeth. Approvals bound to data, not wish. Mechanics received targeted training on the anatomy of this component. Inspectors were told to look for the quiet clues of dry wear, bronze dust, heat marks, threads that look polished where they should look crisp. Airlines revisited staffing and supervision at heavy check contractors. Regulators insisted on verification beyond a checked box. There were softer corrections too, the kind that live in culture. Trust, but measure, became a mantra on some hangar floors. A&P mechanics, who had never touched a jackscrew outside of routine tasks, went home and watched animations of thread profiles because the shape of a tooth suddenly felt like a moral fact. Pilots began to speak a little more bluntly about runaway trim and jam scenarios. Simulators gave them uglier days on purpose. Not because crews failed here, they didn't, but because the story demanded that skills be ready for a tale that might stop being a tale. Out on the water where it happened, the Pacific soon looked the way it always looks, flat from the air, indifferent from a beach. But the line between Anacapa and Point Mugu carries a private weather now in the minds of the people who did the work. Divers remember the pressure and the cold and the way aluminum becomes soft when it's been worried by current. Investigators remember the day the nuts cross-section came into view under a scope and the room got very quiet. Families remember a phone call, a line of cars, an airport chapel, a timeline that ends at 4:22 p.m. Stand in the maintenance bay of any airline at midnight and you can hear this story without anyone telling it. It's in the way a lead tech sends a junior back for the exact grease, not whatever's open. It's in a QA inspector who says, "Show me your setup," before they accept a number. It's in the awkward pause when someone suggests stretching a task and someone else says, "Not that one." Those hesitations are small monuments. If you want to feel the courage in this story, put yourself in that cockpit for the last 2 minutes, not in the melodrama, but in the craft. 2 aviators wrestled a broken machine into something that almost listened. They did not save themselves. But in the way they fought, inverted, methodical, talking, they gave future crews a template for dignity under impossible loads. And they pointed the flashlight squarely at a piece of hardware that didn't look like a villain until you asked it to hold the sky and found it tired. The Wreckage's final note is not complicated. Sometimes safety is a simple machine and a calendar. Touch the grease on the day you promised. Measure the play with suspicion. Believe the numbers that make you uncomfortable. And when a crew tells you the pitch trim is acting strange, treat that sentence like a flare. Morning at JFK after a long, heavy autumn. The city still wore its grief like a second skyline. Flags were half-mast in memory and habit. American Airlines Flight 587, an Airbus A300-600 bound for Santo Domingo, taxied past jet bridges with windows full of waves and goodbyes, holidays, homecomings, babies to be met, husbands to be teased for staying out late the night before. In the cockpit, Captain Edward States, steady as bedrock, and First Officer Sten Mollin, crisp and methodical. The A300's cockpit felt like a thoughtful room, quiet tones, screens instead of steam gauges, a place that promised order if you offered it the same. Departure from runway 31L threaded a well-worn path over Jamaica Bay. Ahead, a Japan Airlines 747 had launched minutes earlier, climbing heavy, carving invisible spirals in the air behind it. Wake turbulence, those twin corkscrews of disturbed air, trails every airplane, but the big ships write theirs in deeper ink. Controllers gave spacing. Pilots carried a lifetime of cautions in their hands. Stay above the path, offset if you can, be ready for a bump and then another. Climb, gear up, flaps stepping in. The Airbus slid into its initial turn, bank gentle, power sure. Then the first nudge arrived, an honest roll to the right, then left, like a broad-shouldered stranger brushing past and not excusing himself. Sensed as mild sways in the cabin, the wakes are more than discomfort. They are physics reminding you that air has memory. Moline felt the yaw and did what training had taught. Feet to the pedals. The A300's rudder is a powerful fin at low altitude and climb speed, governed by a limiter that meters how much deflection is allowed as speed increases. The system was behaving. The sky wasn't. A second set of jolts rolled through. Moline pressed harder left, then corrected right, then left again, quick, alternating inputs to stop the swing. The move a generation of upset recovery syllabi had praised as being proactive. In many jets, the rudder pedals feel like a corrective whisper. Here, at this moment, each full press was a shout. The loads stacked. With each pedal reversal at climb speed, sideslip grew, and aerodynamic forces rose far faster than intuition expects. The vertical stabilizer, the tall blade that keeps an airplane's nose honest, was made of carbon fiber composite, light and strong when used within the boundaries it was certified to bear. The structure did not fail because of what it was. It failed because the airplane was being asked to carry left-right loads in rapid sequence that exceeded what any tail on a transport category jet is meant to endure. A lurch, felt as a tearing in the bones of the machine more than a sound, announced the unthinkable. The fin departed. Attach fittings sheared in a grim progression, each a sentence ending in a period of shock. The airplane yawed violently, then rolled. Engines, suddenly seeing air from broken angles, wrenched themselves on their mounts, one letting go. In the cabin, time changed shape. Coffee arced in slow-motion comets. A mother tightened her hands around a child so quickly that later, in another world, her arms would ache in silence no one could fix. Out the windows of Bell Harbor, Queens, houses with flags, dogs in yards, the clean line of November light, people looked up and saw a jet moving the way jets don't. There was no long corridor to engineer a miracle. The Airbus, ungoverned in yaw and roll, pitched earthward in a steep, accelerating spiral. The neighborhood took the weight. Homes became flames, streets filled with heat and light that made noon look like midnight. In the first stunned minutes, neighbors rushed forward. Garden hoses, blankets, prayers, everything human scaled against a catastrophe made of numbers too high to count. There were no survivors on board. 5 people on the ground, at home, ordinary and vulnerable as any of us, were taken into the tally no one wants to hold. Then, the stillness that follows the loudest things. Sirens, yes. Rotors thudding, yes. But also that inner quiet that lives in shock as firefighters arrive and do the work that makes them legends in neighborhoods that never wanted them to be. Within hours, yellow tape drew lines across streets the way a teacher draws lines on a board. Here, we will try to make sense. Investigators stepped in with notepads and gloves and a reverence that looks like restraint. The vertical stabilizer, stark and intact in wrongness, was found in the bay. That fact alone told a story. The fin had come off in flight. The brake was not born in the impact's chaos. Clues accreted. The cockpit voice recorder covered seconds, then fractions of seconds. Radio calls routine until they weren't. A quickening exchange of small words, then a chorus of physics. Flight data traced a jagged pattern of rudder deflections, rapid, alternating near the limiter's edge, superimposed on airspeed and yaw rates that turned numbers into a dirge. Composite and metal fragments from the fin's root bore the signatures of overload, not fatigue. The bright, fresh look of something asked to carry too much too quickly. The wake from the JL 747 was real, measurable and survivable. Innumerable flights passed through such wakes each week. What made this different was not the existence of disturbed air. It was the human-machine conversation that followed. That conversation stretched backward in time into a classroom. At American Airlines then, upset recovery training, inspired by noble intent to give pilots tools for the unusual, contained a seed of risk. It framed rudder as a primary actor in countering roll-yaw disturbances. It praised aggressive inputs to stop the swing, building a muscle memory that made sense in slower regimes or smaller angles, but could be hazardous in the narrow slice of speed and configuration Flight 587 occupied. Airbus, for its part, had built a rudder system with strong authority at low speeds that tapered with airspeed, but the pedal feel did not rise in proportion to the load at the tail. Feet could ask for more than the structure should be given without the sort of tactile warning that some expected. Different philosophies met in a wake they did not mean to. The secret in these remains wasn't a hidden defect or a saboteur. It was the way good intentions, training zeal, design choices, the confidence that comes from many uneventful days can add up to a new vulnerability when the air surprises you. The fix, as ever, would require humility. American rewrote its upset recovery approach, de-emphasizing rudder in roll control and insisting on aileron and pitch first, with rudder reserved for engine failures and coordinated turns. Industry-wide, syllabi changed. Avoid rapid alternating rudder inputs. Know the loads that live behind the pedals. Recognize wake encounters as events to ride through with patience and gentle hands, rather than to fight. Manufacturers examined pedal feel and travel limiters and the language in manuals so that pilots would better hear what the airplane was saying through their feet. Regulators published guidance that drew a clean line through the lesson. Structural limits are real, even when adrenaline and training say, do more. Queens kept its memorials. The Rockaways gathered every year with names and flowers, with flags that meant grief as much as nation, with stories that began in kitchens and ended at the bay. The Dominican community held vigils that smelled like coffee and salt and candles. To fly between New York and Santo Domingo is to carry a rope between families, and that rope frayed that morning in a way that no airline can mend alone. Firefighters and neighbors bore scars you can see and others you can't. The map of the city added a dot where sorrow lives. And yet the arc of this series, these 8 chapters dug from metal and mud and water, has not been about fear. It has been about listening. Wakes and wind shear, jack screws and oxygen canisters, bulbs and modes and blades that spin until they come apart. Each wreck taught something we did not want to learn. And then we learned it anyway. The sobering gift of aviation is that its mistakes are legible if we have the patience to read them. Its redemption is that those readings become checklists, training profiles, maintenance cards, sensors, caps, grease guns, and sentences in manuals that save strangers you will never meet. Stand for a moment in Bell Harbor in your mind after the fires cool. The bay is still. The gulls complain. A bit of aluminum glints in sunlight under shallow water until someone, kind and careful, lifts it and gives it to the people who write the truth. What those people hand back to us is not comfort exactly. It is duty to respect limits, to question shortcuts, to treat routine as a thing that must be earned every day. The secret in the wake and the rudder was not that air is dangerous. It was that even our best habits need auditing. We have followed the trail through fields and swamps and oceans and city blocks. We have listened to metal and heard our own voices in it. Proud, fallible, learning. We end not with a moral, but with a promise. To keep asking what the wreckage is still trying to tell us, and to keep writing those answers into the ordinary miracles of departure boards and safe arrivals. That finally is how you bury a secret properly. You don't hide it. You plant it where it can grow into something that holds.